Welcome. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Those of you who are here with us in the Zoom, and also those of you who are watching this in the future, welcome. My name is Laura Leonard. I am the acquisitions editor at Herald Press, which means I have had the great joy of working with Kevin Nye on his book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, since the very beginning, which was sometime early last year. So we're all here to talk about this book tonight. Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness. This was published with Herald Press last summer. If you haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, that's okay. You are very welcome here. We'll be talking about some of the ideas Kevin talks about in the book, hear more about his heart for people experiencing homelessness, and really have a great conversation. This is our CommonRead conversation. And I just want to highlight a few things for you all before we get started. There is a free PDF study guide that is available. It has questions for further reflection, conversation. That's available on the Herald Press website. And also, until the end of April, you can use the code CommonRead to get 30% off a purchase of 4 or more copies of this book. That is a great opportunity to get some copies for a small group, a Sunday school group, a group of friends, that any way that you want to talk about this book. All of that information is available at commonread.org. You don't need to remember that code or anything like that right off the top of your head, but just know that that's there. I'll try to remind us again at the end of the evening. Another reminder, as we are talking, I'll be asking questions. Kevin and I will be having a dialogue for the first 3/4 or so of this conversation, but at the end, we'll have an opportunity to open it up for questions from you all. So there's a chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So as the conversation is going, at any time, you can feel free to put questions in there. We won't be getting to them until the end, but just know that that's there. And I'll give you a heads up as we're kind of finishing up our time of conversation with me and Kevin to know that questions are coming. So if you have something you've been thinking about, you can get it in there. Well, it's my great joy to introduce this book's author, Kevin Nye. Kevin is the housing director at an organization addressing youth homelessness in Minneapolis, and he's the author of Grace Can Lead Us Home, which came out last August with Herald Press. He is a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary and completed the course of study and necessary hours for ordination in the Church of the Nazarene before stepping away from the ordination process and surrendering fully to this vocation to which God has called him. Kevin is quickly becoming a recognized and respected voice on the intersections of faith and homelessness, and he has written on these issues for publications including Sojourners, Fathom Magazine, and Red Letter Christians. Welcome, Kevin.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much, Laura.
You are welcome. Well, we didn't actually talk about this beforehand, so I don't think this is bringing too much on you, but I wonder if you might give just a brief overview of what your book is about and how you came to write this book.
Sure.
Really dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is essentially my effort to bring, I think, my whole self to bear, because I grew up in a Christian home, a Christian denomination, pursued a call to ministry, as you described in my bio. I got an MDiv. I did all the things that a person does to end up being an ordained minister. But along the way, I ended up being kind of, maybe sidetracked is the wrong word, but it felt appropriate at the time, in doing and having a career in homelessness, and homelessness services. And as I continued to do that, and as I stepped away from the ordination process, I just kept seeing over and over again that, one, I was learning best practices, right? And I was seeing synthesis between those in my faith, but I was also seeing a lot of Christians, a lot of Christian organizations, nonprofits, feeling very stuck or feeling very overwhelmed or confused by the issue of homelessness, or sort of using practices that weren't best practices. And so my goal with the book was to help Christians kind of get past all of these things that get us stuck on the issue, whether those are just misconceptions or myths, or just a feeling of overwhelmed because there's so many factors that intersect with where do we even start? All of these things that kind of well up in us when when the topic of homelessness comes up. And so I wanted to write back, to my Christian community about what I'd learned and what I had come to.
Yeah. Well, that transitions well into this next question. This question I have for you. So, Grace Can Lead Us Home is the title of the book. The central theme of this book is grace. It just runs throughout every chapter, looking at how it ought to form and shape our response to homelessness and the housing crisis. So you mentioned, you were seeing Christian organizations, churches, individuals, responding in less than ideal ways to homelessness. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like? Where have past Christian responses to these very important issues lacked grace, and why? Why do you think it's lost in these conversations? And then to add, kind of to expand that as well, how might you respond to someone who says to you, oh, like grace is great in theory, but when it comes to something like homelessness, we need to approach it from a practical perspective or from a fairness perspective, and that might feel in conflict with a grace perspective.
Yeah. Well, for starters, I mean, I think you can talk about the Christian both individually and corporately, right? On an individual level, something I open with in the book was a study that was conducted where they asked a bunch of people to choose between the following options of why someone experiences poverty. And the two choices were, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but either unfortunate life circumstances or bad decisions and choices. And it was about 50-50 even split on the general population. But when they broke down the demographics of who answered, they found that Christians were actually more than twice as likely than non-Christians to say that people were poor because of bad life decisions rather than unforeseen or unfortunate circumstances. And so that tells me, one, that something about our theology or the way we conduct ourselves in faith has us leaning more towards this idea that people who are poor, people who are experiencing homelessness, deserve it. And that they're experiencing that because of that it's a consequence of bad life decisions, right? And the what that can quickly lead to is, therefore I don't have to care, or therefore my I would just be enabling if I helped them, right? All of these things follow from that ungracious idea that somebody is experiencing the consequences of their own badness, right? So that was one piece of it. And then additionally, if you look at a lot of the models of, and it's not just Christian organizations, but it's especially Christian organizations, really function on this very merit-based model of services where people who are entering into their services have to sort of continuously prove over and over again along the way that they're worth investing in. So sometimes that looks like, this is kind of more out of vogue now, but was very common 10, 15 years ago, was that if you wanted to be served a meal at a shelter, you had to sit through a sermon first. Now it might look like having to demonstrate sobriety before being allowed into a shelter, or complying with a particular treatment program before being given a housing placement. And ultimately, in addition to just not working as a model, because that's not how people change their lives, right, is not by coercion but by support and grace. It just felt to me very, very unchristian, very against this idea of grace that says we don't get what we deserve, right? God gives us good things because of who God is, not because of who we are and what we've done. And so for me, there was just such a disconnect between what we believe about God and how God treats us and how God says we should treat others, and how we were interacting with homelessness. And so in terms of answering your last question about, what about, grace is nice in theory, but we just need to be practical. I mean, that doesn't feel very Christian to me, right? That like our Christian values are, only good until the rubber meets the road, right? If we believe this stuff, then it's got to be true, in everything. It's either true or it's not, right? I think you're muted.
Yes, I just just realized. Yes, absolutely. I also think of, as you're saying that, I think of, in the book you also talk about how often like those things that we assume, we assume that fairness or practicality is going to work, often don't. That we have data that shows. So that's something I really appreciated in this book, was looking at how these models have actually failed to achieve the results that we hoped that they would, or assumed that they would.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say even more than that, something that's kind of like the insidious byproduct of these models is that when we put all these stipulations on, deserving the very basic help, when people do fail or don't meet up to that, then they fully live into this label that we give them that they're not deserving, right? And so these models that sort of ask people to like prove their worthiness are sort of, self-fulfilling prophecies in a way, because they're starting out suspicious, and then when people fail for very normal human reasons, then they're sort of forever branded as, unhelpable, or they just want to live this lifestyle. They don't want help. They just want a handout, and really it's a problem with the help. It's not a problem with the person.
So the subtitle of your book, we've talked about the title. Now the subtitle is A Christian Call to End Homelessness. So what role does our faith play in our response to homelessness? What makes a Christian response to this crisis? And then also, like, what unique perspective or hope do you think a Christian response offers into this larger conversation? Because, homelessness is a crisis across North America, across the world, and it's not only Christians who are engaging in this work. So what do we offer as Christians into this larger conversation?
Yeah, it's a question I've gotten a lot, and that I think sometimes is misunderstood what I'm saying with that subtitle, because I had someone on social media reach out and say like, I'm not a Christian, so you think that I can't help? And I'm like, no, not at all. In some ways, I was, as I said earlier, I was kind of writing this book back to my people. Like, my people are, are Christian people. That's been my community. That's, always been my community. And sort of, in some ways, it's a rallying cry in a way that I know we speak the same language, and we can communicate about this in ways that, we both relate to, in like the words and teachings of scripture and of Jesus. But I do think especially Christians have an opportunity to really lean into this work, and some advantages that we have, some theologically, like we've already talked about with grace, but also just like practically and physically, the amount of space that we have, the amount of property that we have. I think that something really noteworthy with homelessness and housing is just how little housing there is, and how few places people have to go during the day who are experiencing homelessness. More and more, we're seeing criminalization happening for people just for existing, on the sidewalk or on a bus bench or in a park. And I think that churches have a really beautiful opportunity to open up space even more than they already do for people to come and exist without feeling a need to spend money, or to feel a need to sort of prove or justify their presence or their existence, right? And then I also think that churches just have an inherent model of community that isn't always shared across our society, right? This idea that, we belong to each other and we do life together, and that community isn't limited to particular socioeconomic status or particular um, racial or ethnic groups, right? That we understand that kind of whoever comes in these doors is part of the community today and ongoing, and that's something that people who experience homelessness, I think, are also people who experience a lot of isolation, who've experienced a lot of broken communities and broken relationships. And so I think the church just has something unique to offer in that way.
Yeah, this is making me think about, you've talked a bit about misconceptions people have about homelessness and the unhoused. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what are some of those misconceptions, especially I'm thinking about one of the things that you do so well and powerfully in your book is share stories of experiences you've had that have marked your journey in understanding the issues and the crisis even better. I'm wondering if you might be able to talk to us a little bit about what are some of those things that you wish people understood a little bit better about homelessness and people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some of the very common misconceptions that kind of stem from what we were already talking about, right? I think the big misconception that sort of undergirds all of them is this idea that like people are homeless because for some reason they deserve to be, right? Some bad choice, some other thing that's causing it that's internal to them. And so because of that, we really overinflate our sense of how addiction and substance use interact with homelessness, right? There's obviously an interaction there, but it's not as big as most people like to think. And the same is true with mental illness or poor mental health, right? There's obviously an overlap, but not everyone who experiences homelessness is diagnosed with a mental illness. Not everyone who experiences homelessness uses illegal substances, right, or misuses alcohol. And the rates are below 50%, so it's not even half, right? I think it more so what I wish people understood about homelessness, and it's something that took me a long time, and something that even as I was writing the book, I was really kind of finalizing or understanding, was this sort of balance between recognizing that people who are experiencing homelessness do have needs and do need, support and interventions of things like housing and treatment and medical services. But at the same time, they are not helpless, and they are not, they're not like helpless victims or in need of just somebody to come in and take over. People who experience homelessness are some of the most resilient people that I've ever met. If you can survive on the streets, there's very few things you can't do, right? And I think the two approaches from kind of the two major camps, right, are, hey, you need to go get a job and get yourself off the street. And on the other side, it's, here, let me come in, you helpless little thing, and you do everything I say, and I'm going to get you your life together for you. And both of those approaches completely miss the humanity of the person, right? That the truth of that person is that they are not able to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, or they would, right? But also that they are a person with skills, with dreams, with desires and hopes, and probably with a plan for how they want the next step of their life to be and look like. And what they need is somebody to come and partner with them in that, to actually provide support coming alongside, rather than a heavy hand coming in and forcing them in a particular direction.
So I'm curious to hear a little more, if you would share with us about what are some signs of hope you see in this homelessness crisis, in this movement to end homelessness. What are you seeing? You're on the ground doing this work every day. What's happening that is good and hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in some ways I'm discouraged by a lot of things that are happening. As I said earlier, criminalization is kind of coming back up to levels that it hasn't been in a long time. And that's really unfortunate because it doesn't work, it doesn't help. But where I've seen signs of hope are more people being interested in the topic, and not to make it about my book, but writing this book has given me a lens into people who have expressed interest and who are asking really good questions, who are clearly coming at this and saying things. I mean, something I hear a lot is, I know that I have myths, but I don't know why they're wrong. And I don't know how to disprove them for myself, or when other people bring them up, like, I know that it's not right, but I don't like, I can't argue with it, you know? And that to me has been really encouraging and inspiring. I think from a kind of broader systems level, something that's been very hopeful for me is the way that medical models have been more involved in homelessness. So, for example, some of the larger like medical insurance companies like Kaiser and Blue Cross have actually started to recognize that in the long run, they will save money by providing housing as a medical intervention. Because often what happens is people who experience homelessness kind of allow their physical health to deteriorate to a point of emergency, and then they go into an emergency room, and that's the most expensive way to get medical care, right? And then if they don't have a place to discharge them to, they know that that person is just going to be right back, right? Or if they send them with a prescription to a pharmacy, they know like that medicine might get stolen from them or go missing the next day. And so I think these companies are starting to see, maybe we need to invest in housing as part of a medical model. And then here in the Midwest, for those who are on state-run health insurance, they're starting to introduce housing stabilization as something that you qualify for under state-run health insurance, where you can, if you are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, you can actually get access to a case manager and some money to move in and get, restarted in an apartment, all through your health insurance. So I think seeing, what obviously I don't think it should be incumbent on the medical system to solve this problem, right? But it's exciting and hopeful to see new ways that people are taking this seriously and picking up the burden that others are dropping.
Yeah. Yeah, it is exciting to hear some of the ways that people, systems, institutions even are, finding new ways to powerfully address the underlying issues. I'm curious, what is your vision for the church stepping in? Can you tell us about it? Give us that vision, the grand vision of the church stepping in to this movement to end homelessness. What would that look like in its perfect form, do you think?
Sure. I mean, I would love to see churches, utilizing their property in more effective ways. And I've seen this where, churches that close choosing to sell to an affordable housing developer rather than a luxury housing developer. It might mean taking a little bit less profit for the district, but you're actually leaving the city, in a better place. It's an act of loving the vulnerable in your city, right? I think churches that can offer their parking lots for folks to camp out, or folks who live in their car to park safely overnight. As I said earlier, opening up facilities during the day where most churches are not occupied except for some folks in the office, right? For people to be able to come in and get out of the weather and maybe drink some coffee and hang out. I think that would be a big, huge part of it. And then on top of that, churches getting a little more involved with, local efforts to produce more affordable housing and to decriminalize homelessness and poverty, right? prevent what's happening across the country, where it's basically a crime to set up a tent anywhere in the city when that's all people have as an option.
Yeah. So how can we as individuals or as church groups, how can we join in? Like what are some of what's the advice you would give to take our maybe first steps into that journey, if that's something that is newer to us?
Yeah, I think, yeah, as an individual or as a church, I think, survey what already exists in your neighborhood. We don't need to be reinventing the wheel or duplicating services, right? And find where those gaps are. And on it, the fastest way to find where those gaps are is to ask people experiencing homelessness what the gaps are. I think the fastest way to do some good is to start entering into relationships with people who experience homelessness in your vicinity. And obviously that needs to happen on their terms and not yours. But I've found that, time and again, if you're entering with an ear to listen and not, as I said earlier, that heavy hand that says, I'm here to save you, do what I say, that folks are eager for connection and relationship, and you can earn a lot of trust by actually listening to what they say they need and working to provide it. And that can happen at an individual level, just as simply as, that person that you drive or walk by every day, just asking them like, hey, I see you here. Like, what's something I can bring you tomorrow that will brighten your day? And it might be something you expect to hear, or maybe it'll be something, oh, I never would have thought to bring that, but you've made that connection, right? You've made that personal connection. And then as a church, really, I mean, thinking of your unhoused neighbors, as part of, the parish to which you as a church are designated to serve. When I grew up, and in my neighborhood church, if new neighbors moved into the house, a few doors down, the church would be like, ooh, there's new neighbors. But that's not how we usually respond when a new encampment pops up. It's like, oh no, these outside invaders are here, right? So I think reorienting that and sort of understanding that people who experience homelessness, wherever they show up, they're part of the neighborhood now.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question that you've probably been asked in every single interview. I know even when I tell people I worked on a book about homelessness, this is always kind of the first question is, and you write about it powerfully in your book, is what do I do if I'm walking down the street and a person experiencing homelessness, asks me for money? How do I respond to that? So I'm wondering if you could just talk about that. I loved the way that you handled this in the book.
Yeah. So the first thing I say is that we should be thinking about these interactions before they happen, right? Like, for any of us who live in kind of big urban cities, like, this is an interaction we have. And yet so often we're caught off guard by it, right? So I think kind of deciding what your answer is going to be ahead of time. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. I think there's right or wrong reasons we can get to that answer, coming back to these kind of myths and misconceptions. But the decision of whether or not to give money, I don't think it's a right or wrong thing. I think you go into that knowing what are my boundaries. Am I going to give this much? Am I going to give none? Am I going to be prepared with something else that I feel more comfortable giving? Will I give under these circumstances and not under these? Maybe if I'm walking alone at night, I'm maybe not going to, but if I'm with somebody or I'm feeling more like safe and comfortable, I can do that. Again, I don't want to, I want to make sure these are based off of truths and not misconceptions that, every person experiencing homelessness is dangerous or out to get you, right? But also I think as humans, we understand that some situations are more safe and make us feel more vulnerable than others, and we can honor that without feeling guilty. I think really what we need to understand is that, like, the most important thing that's at stake in that interaction is our shared humanity, right? whether we give someone money or not, we can still honor that person's dignity, whether it's just saying, you know, hey, I'm sorry, I can't right now, rather than pretending like we don't hear them. Because I can tell you, they know you're ignoring them. They know you can hear them. And it's just shattering to be ignored in that way. So figuring out what's my response if I'm not going to give, under what circumstances am I going to give, knowing that going in will help you be prepared and not so overwhelmed in that moment.
Yeah. One of the chapters that you have in the book is on, well, it's the final chapter before the conclusion, is on abundance, beauty, and celebration, which I love because that's just not the way that most of us enter into this conversation. So I love that you centered that and have a whole chapter built around it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, even it could be stories, but about the importance of thinking about abundance, beauty, and celebration when we approach this topic of homelessness.
Yeah. So early on in the book, I talk about community, right? And we've talked about it here tonight, this idea that, people who experience homelessness, like any people, crave connection and relationships, and having a supportive community is how any of us succeed with anything. And something I realized being in this model of homeless services, it was really based on community, was how much communities really kind of thrive and depend on rituals and celebrations, right? Like as Christians, we know this, like we have holy days, we have rhythms of the church calendar, depending on whether your denomination, to what extent they practice that, right? And like those are things that make communities whole. And as I was working at this place that prioritized building community with people experiencing homelessness, I realized like we don't have any celebrations. We don't have any parties. We might, someone says it's their birthday, we might sing them happy birthday, but we didn't have those rhythms that I think we all connect with and crave. And so something I write about in that chapter was that we started an annual party, and the sort of tagline for it was "Everyone deserves a party," and it was just based on this idea that of throwing a party for folks who quote unquote don't deserve it, right, or who aren't typically on party guest lists. And this is especially, we were in Hollywood, California. So thinking about like, an exclusive Hollywood party, like the folks that we were serving would probably never be allowed in or invited to something like that. So it felt all the more special that we were doing it, in that context, right? That in the middle of Hollywood, we were throwing a party and inviting, the people that would get kicked out everywhere else, and every year it was just my favorite thing, watching people just kind of like come alive in ways that, we're so used to thinking of homeless services or homelessness as being this like miserable existence and survival, and like we just need to meet their bare needs to keep them going one more day, but to put that aside and say like, no, we're throwing a party together and we're hanging out and we're eating popcorn and listening to a live band and taking pictures and throwing confetti, is just it's hard to really put into words, which is why it took me so long to write that chapter and then rewrite it. But just this notion that is very biblical, right? Jesus has a parable about, throwing a party and inviting the least of these, right? It was the most special celebration of what I think the kingdom of God looks like, that, it's breaking down this, like, I am the helper and you are the helpee. I'm the fortunate one and you are the person that needs my saviorism to come in and fix you, like all of that was just stripped away and there was just celebration.
Yeah. Well, you did a great job with the chapter. I feel like, yeah, it's very powerful to read. So I thank you for the work you put in to be able to express some of what you were able to experience with those parties. A reminder to the chat, to everyone, if you do have questions, this is the last question I'm going to ask Kevin before I open it up to the group. So if you've had questions that are forming in your mind or things you'd like to pick Kevin's brain about, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and we'll get to those in just a few minutes after we go through this next question. But yeah, you can go ahead and feel free to start typing them in if you've got those. But just a reminder, keep your sound off, just put it in the chat and I will ask the questions to Kevin. So Kevin, my last question for you, before we move into Q&A is, what is the one thing you most hope readers take away from your book?
Yeah. So I want readers to leave feeling like they have an entry point to this issue that can feel so daunting, right? Like I described at the beginning, there's just this sense of like, this problem is too big, it's too complicated, I don't know where to start. I hope people at the end of my book feel like they know where to start, and that that start comes down to finding a way to participate in solidarity and communion with people who experience homelessness. That idea of entering in as yes, an outsider, but as a partner, as a fellow community member, as a neighbor, whether that's as a church coming alongside an encampment, whether it's you at your workplace coming alongside the person who sets up outside where you work, or that person that you pass on the way, just that you understand that new way of relationship and community, and how that's a mutual relationship, and that right there is the transformative beginning of what any of us can do about homelessness.
Well, thank you. Just a reminder, feel free to go ahead and add questions. I'm not seeing any yet. So to give you all a little more time to keep thinking about any questions that you want to hear about, I can go ahead and ask Kevin another one. So you open the book with a note on language and the way that the ways that we talk about homelessness. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the choices that you made for the book, but also just that larger idea of thinking about, like, how does the way that we talk about things matter? What should people know? What do people need to know about that?
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to start the book that way because, there are plenty of folks who had never heard the phrase people experiencing homelessness or unhoused, whereas in my line of work, we use those all the time, right? The reason that we use those words rather than saying, homeless person or the homeless, one is because we try to use person first language, so that when we say people experiencing homelessness rather than homeless people, we're acknowledging first that they're people, right? But also in that phrasing, we're acknowledging that homelessness is an experience rather than a character trait. Whereas we bring so much baggage to the idea of a homeless person that may have nothing to do with that person's actual life or lived experience, but is these stereotypes and caricatures that have been given to us over and again. So highlighting the person first. The other one that we use, saying unhoused, it's not person first, but what I like about it is, one, it kind of shakes our brain loose a little bit because it's a word we're not used to hearing. So again, we don't bring all those preconceived ideas to it like we would when we say homeless. But also the way that word is different than homeless. Unhoused sort of reminds us that it's a community's responsibility to house people rather than it is an individual's responsibility to own housing. So when we say homeless, we're describing what a person doesn't have. When we say unhoused, we're talking about somebody who is not being provided for in the way that they need. And I think the reason I'm never prescriptive about that in saying like, oh, these are the words everyone or that you should use is because the people I most often hear say homeless people are people who are homeless, right? And I would never say like, oh, you shouldn't talk that way about yourself, because that's not my place. But I use the words that I use because I think that they shape me. And I think that the way that I talk about it changes the way I think about it. And the way I think about it, as we've talked about, is it's so important to get that right.
Yeah. I think that's such a powerful reframing that for me, like, especially the way that you talk about unhoused, making it a communal responsibility versus an individual's, lack of achieving something. I think that's extremely powerful. Okay, we have a few questions popping up in the chat now, so I'll go ahead and ask you those. First question, do you see many people transitioning from homelessness? And yeah, I'd love to hear maybe some stories you have around that of what that does, like what that does tend to look like.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I do for my day job. And it looks different every time, but obviously there's a variety of ways that you can get there, whether it's through, getting a voucher and then moving into an apartment, or gosh, I mean, there's a billion different ways that it happens, right? But it happens all the time. I think when we're talking about how homelessness kind of seems pervasive and like it's not going away, I think something interesting to note, and this was especially true when I was still in Los Angeles, when we were, I want to say, and I have this in the book, I think it was 2019 numbers. So we do the point in time homeless count every year. And then we sort of break those numbers down and learn what they're telling us. We actually learned that year that Los Angeles County as a whole housed more people than we ever had, like something like a record. Like we housed like 30,000 people we took from homelessness and transitioned them out of homelessness and into housing. But that same year, 35,000 people became newly homeless for the first time. So if it is feeling like daunting and like it's never ending, it's not because people aren't transitioning out. It's because we're not stopping the inflow upstream, right? But yeah, I can tell you it happens all the time, every day, that people are transitioning out of homelessness, and it looks all kinds of ways. Something else that was interesting that came out of those numbers is we did house that many, but when we actually looked at the funded programs, those only accounted for less than half of those, and that most of the people who transition out of homelessness do so on their own.
Wow. Yeah, that's a surprise to me.
Yeah.
We have another question. This is a good practical one. So this one says, I know it isn't a dichotomy, or at least it shouldn't be, but if a congregation had to choose between putting energy into connecting with unhoused neighbors to build relationships and learn more, or working to build affordable housing, where do you think the energy would be best spent? And this is what they add in parentheses. It is so hard to ask this and avoid sounding like the question comes from a point of view of saviorism. So we will acknowledge, sometimes, if you have to choose one, like, where would you advise, or how would you advise, I should say?
Gosh, it's the hardest question, and I wish I didn't get asked it all the time. And I'm not even talking about because of the book. I was literally on a call 2 days ago where through new legislation, about $4 million became available to either the city of Minneapolis or Hennepin County. And they were asking homeless services providers, like, hey, these are the things we can use it on. We can use it to build new affordable housing, or we can use it to fund current programs. We can use it to support nonprofits with, staffing and all that. What do you guys think we should spend it on? And we're like, oh, that's so unfair, because you're basically asking us, like, you can do one of two things. You can help the person that's right in front of you, or you can help the person 3 years from now who's going to be right in front of you if you don't help them now. right? And to me, that's what this question is asking. And I get it. It's so hard. Like, if you can do both, we have to do both, right? And so I think that's where maybe checking in with what else is going on in the neighborhood and in the area, like, instead of thinking like, should my church do this one or that one, maybe looking from a wider perspective and saying like, what's happening in this neighborhood or this city? Are there more resources going into that long-term housing, or or there more places that are helping folks right now, right? And then choosing to do the one that there's less of. That might be where I would start, but again, it feels like just the most horrible choice.
All right, well, we have time for a couple more questions. If people have any more you want to put in the chat, while we give it another minute or two to see, what other questions you might have, I'll ask Kevin. I'm wondering if you might talk to us about what are for you like some like scripture or biblical passages that most like inform your work in this, or that kind of shifted your view about the importance of really working to end homelessness as Christians.
Yeah. Well, before I say that, I do want to say, and I usually say this in terms of when I get questions, I want to throw out there, like, there are no bad questions. Like, this is a safe place to like ask a question and have it perceived with nothing but grace, right? That's what the book is about. I won't assume any bad intentions if you say the wrong word or the wrong thing, or ask a question that feels like, oh, I don't know, I don't want him to think I think this way, but I really want to know this. Like, throw it out there. But to answer your question, Laura, I think something that's interesting was that there were certain passages or certain like ways that my theology changed that got me into this work, right? And so that's, studying the prophets and the call to, social justice, really relearning what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Blessed are the poor," having that lens kind of brought to my faith in college that I hadn't been really exposed to before. And passages like, Jesus saying, "Whatever you've done for the least of these, you've done to me," kind of launched me into, wanting to do a career like this. But then actually getting into the work and meeting people really then changed how I came back to scriptures like that. So I talk about this in the book where, the passage, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me," was big for me. And like, oh, that makes me want to go, work in homelessness because I'm in LA and homelessness seems like the very obvious least of these around here, But then after spending time and kind of learning best practices and kind of confronting my own tendencies towards saviorism, I then, revisiting that passage, realized that, oh, if I actually believed that people experiencing homelessness were Jesus, then I wouldn't show up thinking I was the savior in the story, right? I would actually show up with a posture of listening, a posture of, you have something for me to learn. You have something to transform me, rather than me showing up here to transform you. And that's not to minimize, right, my role in that relationship and what I have to offer, but it's a kind of a recalibration of that relationship, because so often Christians and non-Christians alike in social services settings show up in ways that maintain or even reinforce the hierarchy, right? That I am still above you. I am the case manager. You are the client. And I mean, those designations are helpful for things like boundaries, but they're very unhelpful for those who show up like I did for a long time and still struggle with, in ways that I'm here to help you. Please get with the program.
Another question just came in. What role do you think there is for political advocacy and activism in ending homelessness? And what issues should we be encouraging our politicians to take action on?
Yes, absolutely. It's a big part of it, because ultimately what drives homelessness is housing policy, and housing policy is extremely political, and it happens It happens certainly at the federal level. It happens on, on the big ballot stuff, but it also happens very, very often really far down your ballot on the things that like you normally don't even bother to look up. By the time you get there on the ballot, you're like, oh, I already voted for the right person for president, and I helped my swing state get, that seat that they need in the Senate. So everything else I don't care about. That stuff is really where the real action happens for the people in your neighborhood who are experiencing homelessness, right? Like who are the judges, who are the city council people, how much of their campaigns were paid for by luxury housing developers, right? Like I honestly think more churches need to get nerdy about zoning, to get like really interested in like a city's housing plan. Something that I've been hearing a lot from activists is that a city budget is a moral document. And I think that's really powerful. And I want to extend that further. So every city has something called a housing element, which is sort of their plan and their requirements for like any new housing has to meet these requirements, or it has to be this percentage, this, and those are always voted on and re-ratified every period of years. And I want to go farther and say that a housing element is a moral document. A housing element is a theological document that I think churches should really get in the weeds on. And then in terms of activism, I absolutely think that churches should be involved in activist efforts to secure affordable housing, and also to protect encampments that are getting swept, getting moved around, getting terrorized by local officials who are just trying to assuage wealthy donors by moving people around rather than creating real solutions.
Yeah, and I'll plug the book again as well. The book in the back of the book, there is a voting guide, which covers a lot of these things. It's not a voting guide in terms of vote for this party or the other. It is laying out what are these issues that you need to be aware of that might be most often on those down ballot issues. And so I highly recommend checking that out if you're looking for that practical advice, because there's some really good stuff in there that will help you navigate those kind of questions in your local community. Well, I think that's it for questions, and we are also closing in on our time here. So we have one more question getting in. This says, by housing element, do you mean housing standards? Housing element isn't a term we use in Canada.
Oh, sure. Yeah, probably then. Yeah, housing element is a term I'm familiar with here in the States.
Great. Well, last call for questions on anyone in the room right now. Otherwise, I would just like to thank Kevin. Thank you all for being here. And Kevin, I'm wondering if you might be willing to say a prayer for us as we go out and hopefully step into this work more and embrace this call to end homelessness, and extend some of that grace that God has shown us.
Absolutely. God, thank you for this time. Thank you for proving to me again and again that people care about this issue, and that people will show up to ask good questions, hard questions, and to enter into solidarity with people that our society has deemed unworthy and undeserving. God, we know that that's not true because you say so. And I'm just so grateful to constantly meet people who believe that too. Please bless us as we go from here. In your name, amen.
Amen. Well, thank you again, Kevin. Thank you all. Just a reminder, commonread.org. You can find the coupon code. You can purchase 4 more copies for 30% off. I hope that you take this conversation from tonight into your communities, into your families, and continue the conversation of how you can step into this work, and show this grace that we have been shown to people experiencing homelessness, to our communities. and learn how to do better. And together we can end homelessness. Well, I thank you for your time this evening, and I wish you all well. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.